All right, so welcome to Off the Chain, where all sorts of people are going to tell us their supply chain story. My name is Eddie Davila, and today, and I'm actually an instructor of supply chain at Arizona State University. And today we're going to be speaking with my guest, Greg Collins. So Greg is, let's see, we just hired him at ASU to teach supply chain just in the last couple of years, but he's got a really interesting backstory, and actually there's a slight intersection with my life too. So Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your story of how you got here?
Well, sure. Well, thanks very much, Eddie. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and of course your audience as well, and students. So, yeah, it's interesting. My journey into the supply chain. When I was growing up, I didn't know many people that went to college. It was something that by the time I went to high school, and Eddie, you and I grew up in the same a village over from each other, and so we did have good high school, and I didn't have a lot of role models kind of when I was a child, kind of a little bit rougher childhood. So I kind of found respite a little bit in school. And so in high school, then, you started to think about, oh, maybe there's a chance to go to college and what to do there. So, at the time, I wouldn't even imagine business or anything practical. I got an opportunity to go to University of Colorado in Boulder, got a scholarship, and I studied physics and philosophy. I mean, my mind was so far away from those things that were practical that it was hard for me to even imagine what my life would be like afterward, because I didn't quite, and you didn't have the resources then to talk about, how recruiters come onto campus, or you didn't have access, you didn't have internet, didn't have email. So you kind of sort of went through it and introduced to people. And so when I graduated, my first job out of college, I was a leadership consultant. And I did that for a couple of years, flying around the US and Canada, wearing a tie. But I was, I needed a shock treatment a little bit. I wanted to kind of learn to think in a different way. I knew this couldn't be the reality for me. So, I'd been a martial artist. I'd been a cinephile for a long time, amateur sinologist. So I really wanted to find a way to go to China. And at that time, it wasn't an open place. And of course, Tiananmen Square happened in 1989, which many of the American companies had pulled out of China, that the very early companies that started to go in there. And the GDP was very small then. You're less than $1 trillion GDP at that point, but it was a very closed kind of place. So I wanted to find a way to go live in China. So I found that able to do that through the Colorado China Council. So I moved to Hunan Changsha, and there was not many foreigners at all. I mean, there was no way English was going to help me. And, I had studied Chinese on my own for a couple of years and thought I could read a little, thought I could speak a little. And of course, when I got there, no one could understand a word I said, and I couldn't understand a word anyone said. So, back to ground zero and having to learn, because there wasn't much to buy. There wasn't lots of shops open then. You weren't allowed to own private property, or it was very much a nascent world there, completely different world. Every assumption, and I loved it because every assumption that I brought, the way I thought was logical, was not logical at all.
I was going to say, was it scary, or was it exciting, or was it a little bit?
Yeah, it was exciting. I tend to like the impossible stuff. When someone says, don't go there, it's dangerous. Use the word communist at that time, if you remember the connotation of the word communism coming out of the Cold War. And so that just made me want to do it more. So I really liked being forced to kind of think in a different way. I mean, I just felt the challenge of the pioneering spirit a little bit, of trying to find my way in that world. And, you fumble a lot. The path to excellence is rocky. So I enjoy that rockiness and the challenge more than anything else. So then I came back, right before I left, I had started consulting for Procter & Gamble on the first products that were trying to do a nationwide launch in China. And foreign products weren't really for sale there. but it was the perch shampoos I called Rejoice and Head and Shoulders. So I was helping them with how are we going to do distribution around China. So I knew nothing about distribution, but in China, everything was fragmented. There weren't freeways or highways, distribution, everything was all regionally managed. So, I got to do it.
What year are we talking here about?
This is 1994.
Okay.
So this is 1994. So, and this was in Guangzhou when I went there from Changsha. So I got a sense of kind of the first initial ideas of what supply chain management was. And I loved the action and the difficulty of the supply chain at that time. The challenge of figuring something out that really doesn't exist now, because so much was in flux during those times. So then I got a chance to come back to the US. I was going to graduate school, got a scholarship at ASU. And that was like the second or third year, I think, of supply chain management as a major for MBAs. And you were one of those the year before me, and in my year. So it was a bit of an early experiment of pulling in planning and logistics and purchasing and transportation into a full idea of supply chain management. So loved it. Graduated from there. I mean, an ASU MBA and supply chain management literally changed my life. I mean, who hired me when I came back from China? Yes, I'm an interesting guy, maybe not. I can speak Chinese, that's about it. But learning supply chain management, and then I launched after graduation into a company, Microsoft. And at the time,
I think I've heard of them.
And it was it was another whirlwind. I'm going to a software company that is trying to build a supply chain. So completely different skill sets, completely different culture. Supply chain management is a real team sport. Software engineering is very individual. So it was a very interesting place, high energy. And then, things like the Xbox was right there. And I was on that. Just going
to say, how much, when you got there, and now you're a much more globally sophisticated supply chain manager. When you look back at Microsoft in the late 90s, how much did they know themselves about supply chain management at the global level?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, at that time you had Microsoft hired the best and the brightest. They people from all over the world. They brought from ASU, international students were going to work for Microsoft in software. They had been growing for a number of years. So they hired a lot of people, and they thought, well, if we can figure out software, we can figure out everything. So the culture of Microsoft was, there are no barriers, we can go figure it out. And I liked that kind of, I liked the challenge of that, the sort of pioneering spirit. You were creating something every moment that didn't exist before and trying to figure out how to launch a supply chain for something like an Xbox. And it was fascinating because at the time, the decision-making process of how we build that first supply chain within the Xbox was based only on the fact that Sony had trouble replenishing Xboxes in the US and China. So that's the same logic of saying,
or their PlayStation, the PlayStation.
Or PlayStation.
Yeah.
So it's the same logic of, I've got a black swan in my pond, therefore all swans are black. Some company had a problem with execution, doesn't mean we need to build it that way. So with a lot of cash on hand, launched that. So Microsoft didn't know how to really manage a global supply chain. So Flextronics was a large partner, and I managed the Flextronics relationship in Microsoft. So very quickly.
So let me kind of give everybody some background, and this is sort of what I want to get into. This is, there's a story that you read in cases and in magazines, and then there's the reality that you lived. And so,
yeah,
in my class, we discussed this sort of old Stanford case and the Wired magazine article from the 90s and early 2000s, and it basically says, Microsoft had their first Xbox had about 1,000 parts. They could have, mean, they had all the money in the world. They had access to brains and power and whatever they wanted. And they decided, well, we could do this ourselves and figure it out, but it's going to take us a little too long. And we might make mistakes. And we've never been in video games before. And if we make mistakes in video games, who knows if anybody's going to sort of really buy into this. And the story goes that, well, they decided we're going to use contract manufacturers. We're going to hire this company on the outside, Flextronics, and they're going to get everything done for us, because if you can make, you know, the difference, the reason that this industry was created was, well, the difference between a phone, a computer, and a television in the 1970s, they were completely different machines. But because of digital, sort of everything started coming together. Now, if you can make one, you can make the other, and the difference is often just size. And so now they can do it better and faster, and let's just have them do it all. And, you know, they lived happily ever after. That's sort of the story that's told. What was going on inside of Microsoft at that time to make that actually happen?
You know, Microsoft didn't have a lot of choice, you know, because the whole purpose of that Xbox was the fear that PlayStation would take the center of the household. And there was already the idea that of the smart home, that if at that time people didn't have multiple PCs and laptops within a family, you had one PC maybe in your family and everybody used that PC. And if the center of the family was taken away from a Microsoft software, Microsoft operating system, and with a PlayStation, they might lose the living room and lose that computer within the home. So to them, the biggest threat was that. And then you combine that with the fact that Microsoft had already been in the PC gaming area. They were designing, working with outside third-party designers for PC games. So we had a lot of fun at Microsoft, playing a lot of games, and had had these setups everywhere and doing things. But that was largely the idea, because we can do computer games based on Windows, and the threat of somebody taking the living room and that center, that operating system away from us, we need to do this quickly, and we need to do it now. So at the time, how do you go about doing that? And Flextronics at that time, you know, most of the contract manufacturers, it was really early years in China anyway, but they were all over the US. Each region would always, and that's how really it started with these board stuffers, and then going into, you know, the PCBA manufacturing. It was just a purchased component based on a design. So everyone had become accustomed in electronics of having someone regionally who could do quick turn boards for them, a PCBA, printed circuit board assembly. So that's kind of, and then from that idea was, if we can do that, can we expand into, you know, final assembly and test of these products for our customers? So that was really nascent at that time. Not many companies would want to trust an outside firm like a Flextronics to go, I'm going to give you more of the value chain of doing a whole final assembly, and even giving you our proprietary functional testers or reliability testers to do that. So the Xbox was really, when you think about supply chain 2.0, Xbox was one of those consumer products that led that. And it was a combination of Microsoft's need and having no idea about the supply chain, and Flextronics' ambition to grow its value chain and grow the company beyond board stuffing. Very low margin business traditionally in contract manufacturing. So that's where that kind of combination seemed to fit out well for Flextronics. Microsoft didn't know how to design a computer, but Flextronics was already building the motherboards for computers, not really doing full box build, but they were doing that and wanting to go more into enclosures, the plastic injection molding enclosures, stamped metal chassis, trying to work with customers to take this value chain. Well, here comes Microsoft, a company that's willing to lose money on the Xbox. They knew that. So it sounds like a good investment to make for the company that is willing, needs to move fast. We can take this and throw a lot of talent at it and make it grow big. So really, when you think about supply chain 2.0 of moving from printed circuit boards to full box build outsourcing, this is really when the term outsourcing kind of began, is when I contract with you, Flextronics, or a Foxconn today for Apple iPhones. If I contract for you, you deliver me a full product. I might give you technical expertise. I might give you text script. I might give you the testers themselves. But you go invest in that, you build it, and then you sell me a product that I can deploy around the world and have greater flexibility in different regions of the world on how much supply chain, how much finished product, and how much inventory I can carry around the world.
Now, some people would say, okay, we're going to let Flextronics create these machines, and they're going to, there's the supply, they're working with suppliers, they're getting a good deal because they're probably buying a lot of the parts already, so on and so forth. A lot of people would say, well, why does Microsoft even need supply chain managers? Because isn't Flextronics doing everything? What's left for the supply chain manager at Microsoft to do?
Yeah, that's interesting. If you think about that first supply chain of that, you had two key technology components, Intel and NVIDIA. So Microsoft work with the supply chain would be with those key component suppliers. They didn't know anything about sourcing plastic resins or PCBA components, resistors, capacitors. And at that time, most of those were fairly local anyway. They were mostly in the US, had just kind of started to move offshore in those very recent years, but there was still a very large captive supply chain in the US for those kind of components. So Microsoft really would only be managing those key components at that time, or managing some finished product at that time for the controllers or for keyboards and for mice. So there was that kind of supply chain management that was more of managing logistics and managing capacity and managing the distribution and the retail piece of that. That was really what supply chain management was, in moving to a retail model, leveraging selling of the box of software at the time. You buy Office and Windows 95, you're waiting at the store to buy Windows 95, and you go in and you buy a box of CDs and you load it on your computer. So Microsoft already had that distribution channel, the retail channels, to sell things like the high-end optical mice. Today it's low-end and cheap for us, but at the time that was one of the very first optical mice that came out. So that's really where Microsoft had some nascent supply chain ability. And it was mostly firefighting and chain management, where you're planning capacity, you're planning components, you're providing long-term forecasts, you're using methodologies and analytics to look at forecasting. It was, what do we think the forecast is going to be? And then we don't have enough, so let's just go launch a whole bunch of people into that supply chain and try to get more capacity out of it and get it into the channel. So it's the heavy lifting of an unorganized supply chain in the beginning, but you had a good group of people that were highly motivated.
So what's that relationship like at the beginning and as time goes along between the managers at Microsoft and the internal managers at Flextronics? What's going on between those two groups?
Well, it's interesting because there is a life cycle of outsourcing. A product will stay in outsourcing. If I outsource the first generation Xbox, outsource to Flextronics, Flextronics, my primary supplier. It's very hard to do work on the design and the launch of a product with multiple parties. So they're my primary supplier. And then you go a little bit of time, and then you realize, okay, I'm losing $150 on every box. I need to reduce cost. I'm losing $1 billion a year, something like that. So we're losing money on the box. We need cost reduction. And maybe a Flextronics, who is traditionally a low margin business, is getting nice higher margins off something, a new product. They provided a lot of services, managing a lot of that supply chain. So the control of the supply chain had shifted to Flextronics. And now the managers in Microsoft start to think, I want to get more control of that cost of the product so that I can better forecast how much money I'm going to lose until I have enough games out there that I can make money and break even on that business and eventually grow profitability. So there becomes a problem with control of the supply chain. So what do? Let's add competition into the mix. Let's bring in a Wistron. Let's bring in a Celestica. Let them quote on the Microsoft Xbox. And this is, a year or so after you launch. And then you start seeing pricing come in. And now that profitability of the contract manufacturer shrinks with 3 now suppliers.
And those three, Celestica and Wistron and Flextronics, they were all manufacturing Xboxes for Microsoft simultaneously. Is that correct?
Well, Flextronics was the first one and always doing the lion's share. Wistron did some. Celestica was second, was a third piece of that, but they never really did significant volumes. It was primarily a Flextronics and Wistron secondarily, but it was Flextronics was always doing the lion's share of that.
So let's go back to you now. You are part of this relationship between Microsoft and Flextronics, and ultimately you end up at Flextronics and back in China. Is that correct?
Yes, and I had been part of that in managing Flextronics, spending a lot of time in China for Flextronics. So this was the move from Hungary and Mexico to China. And this is, you're hitting this around 2000. So in the year of 2000, some interesting forces kind of converged. So a year before, the president of Asia Pacific in Flex that I knew well, knew I spoke Chinese. There was all kinds of, growing opportunity here. Tall Punjabi guy. And my instruction, he said, "Hey man, why don't you come to Flextronics?" I said, "Well, Ash, I'm not really qualified to go run and build and a supply chain. I've never done that before. I've managed massive suppliers and supply chain of components and logistics." But he said, "No problem. Go figure it out." Pretty much my introduction to being the general manager of Flextronics in Shanghai, and then very soon vice president. But what happened, the converging factor, other than Xbox, 2001, the high-tech crash of the Internet 1.0 companies, the stock prices, that caused the big sucking sound of outsourcing to China in particular. We had a nascent infrastructure, but I was starting new factories in Shanghai, Tianjin, Beijing, Nanjing, Changzhou very quickly because Ericsson telecom infrastructure, mobile phone manufacturing, anything that was a PCBA, a circuit board assembly with maybe graphics, anything wrapped around plastic or metal, it was all coming to China very quickly because companies were losing money. Companies like Cisco, for instance, who had been building all their product in the US. So that crash in 2001 caused a huge portion of the value chain over the next 3 or 4 years over to China that just caused the growth of China. So I was in the middle of that. And between that period of 2000 to 2003, in that period of 3 years, my revenue started at 0, and then it was $600 million in 3 years with 5 different operations there. And then we also had another industrial park in South China that was going through the same kind of growth because of the fact we were starting to figure that out of how to operate in China. Most of those components, of course, were all imported to China at that point. So you're managing an import of materials, a build of a product with labor, and then exporting that product. You couldn't ship that domestically within China. There wasn't an open market for us to sell product directly within China. So foreign companies were very much kept in special economic zones at that point.
So you've spent, 20 plus years working in China, on and off, in and out of there. And in some periods of time, probably spending long periods of time in China. Correct?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And during that, you've spent so much time there running facilities in China. Are you more comfortable as a manager in China or more comfortable as a manager in the United States? Or how would you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting difference. When I lived in China from 92 to 95, then I came back to go to graduate school. So by 98, with Microsoft, I'm already back kind of in China operating. but I moved back full-time in 2000 until 2017 or so. So I've become very accustomed to building up operations with people that had no prior training or knowledge in what they're trying to do. So in China, there was no training in supply chain management. There was no training in planning or logistics or any of these disciplines. You hired maybe engineers, maybe you hired people that studied business or some sort of finance, but there was no training in any of this. So in China, you had to build talent very quickly. And that talent came with a very strong openness and hardworking nature, because this was an opportunity of people coming out of poverty, essentially. Their opportunity to come and make $150, $200 a month was extraordinary, especially for operators working on the lines coming from different parts of China. So in that kind of worldview, you're managing in a very different light than you would manage here in the US. On the one hand, you're constantly working with government, local government, and the policies change every week. So the policy changes, so you have to change the way you're operating or find a way around that policy.
Can you give me an example of like what are the types of policy changes that you had to deal with?
Yeah, so you might say, so a policy could be import duties. So you might say, okay, so 1 week import duties on this kind of component are 5%. And so then maybe the next week, okay, that we're gonna, on this category, we're gonna raise this to 10%. And then this category, we're gonna reduce this to 3%, because they were all designed for some incentive that was being given to someone. And not, you're sort of subject to the policies that change because you were not sure what those incentives were being placed. So you would have import duty changes. You would have limits on how much capital you could take out of China, how much equipment. 1 week you were allowed to import used equipment into China, and the next week you were not allowed to have used equipment anymore. You have to buy all new equipment. So there was it was just times of tremendous amount of excitement and change. I had to work with customs officials as much as anything. I had one customs official that he liked every month that I take him out for dinner and drink a lot of baijiu. And if I did, everything ran smoothly with me in customs. If I didn't, if I missed a month or, he didn't feel like he was being respected enough, I'd have a problem with a shipment coming in and saying the paperwork maybe is not right. So it's just different time. You're very active, even to ship a mobile phone. You were not allowed to, a foreign company was not allowed to ship a mobile phone overseas without a permit from the Administration of Information Industry. So you'd have to go to Beijing, and if you went in there and say, sorry, foreign companies are not allowed to do that, because the incentive was going to emerging local Chinese companies that wanted to have more export and build up the capability for mobile phone manufacturing. So then I have to use a relationship to get into an office, explain what I'm doing, more banquets, a little bit of dinners, and then to try to get approval. A stamp on a paper was my approval to be able to ship mobile phones.
So as an American, was it more difficult for you in some cases to develop those relationships, or was it maybe sometimes easier?
Yeah, it's a good question. In some cases, it was a bit easier because I was a bit of a novelty. There weren't many people kind of in my job role that were clearly Westerners that spoke Chinese. So in that way, kind of maybe raised some eyebrows a little bit. People were somewhat entertained by me, and so they kind of it's kind of like a zoo animal in some cases. Like a new spotted tiger, a rare spotted tiger. Let's bring them in the meeting so we can take photos and have an opportunity. So in that way, in the early days, it was a bit easier for me to do things. But because there was so much separation between what a foreign company could do to operate in China, it made things very difficult. So you had to use all the resources that you had to try to figure some of those things out.
How about on the American side? How about when an American company comes in, they see you, an American, sort of running the place, so to speak. How did they react to you?
That was a big comfort factor, I think. I think a lot of my early years in China from that maybe 2000 to say 2010 was really sort of a lot of relief, I guess, saying, okay, that's okay. We've got Greg there. I could get on a teleconference with them, tell them what the situation is. Here's what we need. Here's what here's what our forecast is. Here's what is likely to happen. So in a way, for a lot of those years, I was a bit of a cultural bridge for them. But if I came back to the US, I mean, I realized that, when I'm operating with a US company, just my way of behaving over time. You live 20 years in a country, you change the way you communicate, you change the way you behave. So the reverse culture shock back to the US, even in teaching students in a class, is more poignant than the actual culture shock of going to a place like China and encountering different way of operating and a different culture and a different language. An American goes to China, you're functionally illiterate. You can't read anything, you can't speak anything. Where a international student comes here, they can read, they can read a restaurant name, they can read in English, they can speak in English. So it was a very different time for Americans, which, I would say probably was more to my advantage than not.
Now, there's probably some people out there, young or maybe not so young, who maybe they're listening to you and they're going, this sounds pretty interesting and exciting. Maybe they have that same passion for something different. How different must it be? You went at a very different time in the development of China.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that if you say to yourself, if I tried to do it that way today, it probably wouldn't work. What do you think is what are the avenues to get into a similar situation nowadays?
Yeah, I get a lot of contact from young students or others that want to have some access or want to go work in China. At the time, 15 years ago, I bring in a lot of expats from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, because of some expertise they already have, because you couldn't find that locally. Whereas today, all those people, all my guys that I'd hired, many of them are all general managers or a vice president of operations or supply chain or GM of a product company. So the talent level now is very high for the technical expert going in. So you can find Six Sigma lean engineers and consultants. You can find Six Sigma black belts in China. You can find people that understand sourcing and the supply chain is so better developed technologies, and in some cases surpass what we had in the US, that the opportunities are a little bit different. And the advice I give young people is, if you want to go to China for adventure, it's a great place to go to adventure. Just don't plan on making a lot of money. I go somewhere where you can learn something very different. Don't go to places like Shanghai and Beijing, because you can live in cities like that and not really live in China at all. You won't have exposure to, but the second tier and third tier cities, which have grown significantly, Wuhan is one of those, 11 million people now, or Changsha or Chengdu in West China. These are very big growing cities now with a lot more opportunities for younger people today. So I'd say focus on those cities and those industries there. And also, if you can build up some operations here, or you work with China later on in your career, you'll have some opportunities because you've been working already with this China supply chain. That would be a third avenue.
Let's get you out on this question. It's Thursday, March 24th, 2020. We're in the midst of the COVID-19 issue here. And as someone who worked in technology devices, someone who worked with contract manufacturing, what are the things that you see that maybe others don't? And what are the things that you say to yourself, man, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that issue right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I've been through a little of this before, during SARS. So right after that Xbox and the startup SARS in 2002, 2003, this is when I had all of these different operations with employees and essentially a kind of a very rapid lockdown. That time there was not a lot of information. Government didn't have a lot of information. There was a lot of fear because of the fact there was no information. So managing a busload of people coming into a factory with 10,000 employees, each bus, if one person tested, with a high temperature, the whole bus would have to go into quarantine for 2 weeks of people. So there was a lot of uncertainty there. And what I learned in that period of SARS applicable to today was, number one, the overreaction early is far less costly than the impact later. And we've learned that in many cases of, if we say, this is not going to be very serious, so let's just not go overboard. But in the case of employees, for instance, today you want to be able to communicate with them upfront on what's going on, communicate with your stakeholders, your suppliers, your customers, your management teams of, here's what is going to happen, and I'm going to go a little bit overboard on my reaction to this for protection because there's a lot of uncertainty there. So at the time, a lot of people didn't do that. And then they go into business continuity planning too late after the event. And then you might go another 10 years after SARS like this. Everything we put into place after SARS is not going to be applicable today in a society. And so that one is the overreaction. And number two is focus a lot on the people. And I noticed this as I come back to ASU, and I didn't anticipate this, but I tend to work a lot with the international students and out-of-state students. I try to find out who they are, because if something like this happens, I immediately want to reach out to them and say, here's what I know at this point. How are you doing? Are you there? Because some of these folks, if they're from overseas, their families are worried. What happens to them. So just keeping people calm, providing a lot of information, and putting in early mitigating actions are just very helpful in keeping things from escalating out of control. And as we see, once that impact starts to hit, it's extremely costly, and you never get that back.
And what do you think is going to, on the human side and more on the parts and materials,
supply chain side,
on the actual supplies, how do you see this playing out over the next month or two?
Oh, and I think one thing that China has shown us through this is there is no going back from the applications of technologies, including mobile technologies, in managing your supply chain going forward. The ability to not only track and trace, but to build in that risk management of what if scenario and being able to respond much quicker with mobile technologies that allow you to respond so much faster in a global environment will change. I think that will change immeasurably after this. The speed, the integration of technology will be stunning moving forward. Even for companies that didn't feel they needed to, or they felt they had stable forecasts, like a toilet paper.
Yeah.
You think you have stable demand, you can calculate a forecast based on history probably fairly regularly. But in this scenario, who would have guessed that toilet paper is, the number one shortage that we have in a coronavirus situation? But you need to build in how we're going to manage inventories, what we're going to have as reserve or strategic inventory. I would expect companies to go overboard on the strategic inventory that they hold after this event.
And that's what I'm thinking too. You probably had people inside companies, salespeople, probably saying, why are we running so low on inventory? We need to have more inventory. Right. It has to be ready to go. And I'm sure now in this once in a lifetime event, they're going, see, we told you so. Right. And companies are going to swing in this other direction. And now you're going to have this massive glut of inventory that you'll never need again, probably.
That's right. And then over the few years, that strategic inventory, because invariably in any supply chain, you swing to that side, you're going to get a tap on the shoulder and say, we need to get a 30% reduction in inventory in the next year. We need to get in the next 3 months a 30% cost reduction. Mm-hmm. Those are invariably going to happen. So the swing and the shifts will calm down, but I think technology will help smooth that curve of the strategic inventory versus deployment of inventory in the field. And I think some of the technologies that China is even using with the health index from Tencent and from Alibaba, working with the local governments, where if you're running an operation expecting 20,000 people to come back, every person is rated low, medium, or high risk based on where they've been, who've been in contact with them, that they can see what to prepare for before in their operations. You know, there are technologies like that that are difficult to deploy here in the same scale, but the supply chain will adopt a deeper integration of more access with technology in the supply chain.
It's a incredible time to be a supply chain management
Oh,
professor, because we get to watch all this and talk to
absolutely.
our students, and yeah, it's so much fun. And I'm sure it's not fun if you're in it, you know, running these organizations, but for us, there's stories are all around us, and we get to, our students are probably, I teach a class that's a required course for every business student. And I'm wondering how many of them at the beginning of the semester were saying, why do I have to take this class? And now they're probably saying, I'm sick of hearing of supply chain. That's all they're talking about every day.
Yeah, it is a fabulous time. And I tell those students, this is a good time to understand and practice these now.
Mhm.
These sort of things provide much more opportunity within the supply chain. They provide new directions and career directions for students as well. When they're going into business, they're changing, you know, supply chain structures, getting on early. And I look at this kind of as a supply chain 4.0 with the implementation of artificial intelligence, with much more IoT management, you know, to keep infections from happening. Do we employ more IoT technologies and build, you know, the protection of people? And there's great opportunities in these times, even though from the human standpoint, we suffer, from the supply chain, you know, disruption standpoint, we suffer, but there's a lot to learn within this disruption that I think is fabulous for students.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We went a little long, but I could keep going on and on forever. We'll have to do this again sometime. Hopefully things go well, and hopefully we'll actually get to see each other in the office sometime in the
Yes,
near
I hope
future.
so, Eddie. Okay, very good.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Sure. See ya.
Thank you. Bye-bye.